are these people?
I think I might, just this segment actually is kind of inspiring me a little bit. Maybe we should do like a book report series or something, like a books of of independent writers, not necessarily independent, but books that for audience you might be interested in reading. So
Well, looks like we got ourselves a reader.
So this is a book that some of you might consider reading. I will warn you, given now I haven't read the book, but it might be one I might strongly consider purchasing. But I will warn you, given some of the experts that the writer of the article I'm going to reference who read the book, it might be triggering to some of you, maybe, but especially those of you who might be American Jewish. You may not like the book. So I'll say why in a minute. But I found this tweet from Caitlin Johnstone, shout out to her, who tweeted something that I think very much relates to the book's thesis. So I do want to share that now before we actually get into it. So she tweeted, I think it was today, only 3% of Jewish Israelis think Trump's ethnic cleansing plan for Gaza is immoral. A poll by the Jewish People Policy Institute has found that more than 8 out of 10 Jewish Israelis support the plan proposed by President Donald Trump to ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip of Palestinians by resettling them in Egypt and Jordan. The poll also found that among the minority of Jews who did not support Trump's plan, only 13% opposed it because they viewed it as immoral. Among Jewish Israelis specifically, the number who opposed the ethnic cleansing of Gaza for moral reasons is just 3%. 3%. If that isn't a sign of a morally diseased society, I don't know what would be. To be clear, we're talking about permanently driving an indigenous population off of their homeland at mass scale so that their territory can be claimed by settlers. This is the sort of crime that even a half-formed conscience would immediately recognize as deeply immoral, but among Jewish Israelis, that figure is just 3%. The moral degeneracy which makes such a large-scale lack of basic human empathy possible is a natural consequence of everything that the state of Israel is and always has been. Jewish Israelis are indoctrinated from birth to view Palestinians as less than human, because otherwise modern Israel makes no sense. It makes no sense for an apartheid state where one group perceives preferential treatment over others to have been dropped on one of a pre-existing civilization whose land, rights, and dignity were then violently stolen from them if you view all the parties involved as equal. So they are trained not to view them as equal. This systematic poisoning of conscience has knock-off effects in all sorts of other areas, though. A 2011 poll published by Haaretz found that 61% of Israeli men don't view forced sex with their acquaintance as R, and that only 7% believe marriageable R is a real thing. R is abundant in the Israeli military and is almost never punished. In 2022, the Jerusalem Post reported that 1,542 incidents of SA complaints were received by the IDF in the year 2020, and that of these, only 31 indictments were filed. Jesus Christ. One need only listen to Israelis discuss values unique to their culture, like Shitak Hamas Zila, I guess that's how you say it, just walking all over people and doing whatever you want to see if you get away with it, or the sin of being a pariah, I guess, someone who plays by the rules and misses opportunities to cheat others, to understand that this is a nation of sociopaths. And it has to be. If Israelis were a deeply moral people with well-formed consciences, there would be no Israel, because the abuses necessary to maintain its existence as a state would never be democratically supported by its people. Israel cannot exist without nonstop violence, tyranny and injustice. So it is vital to the interests of the state that Israelis be the sort of people who would support these things. And in case anyone is confused, this immorality isn't actually about Jews or Judaism. Any group who is pervasively indoctrinated into believing a neighboring group must be treated abusively will be shaped into cruel and ignorant people. Anyone of conscience who has ever interacted with white South Africans above a certain age has likely had a taste of this. It's got nothing to do with anyone's religion or ethnicity. It's just how the abuses of apartheid are upheld. This is the depraved entity the entire Western world is being told it must support unconditionally. An apartheid state which twists its own people into monsters so that they will participate in monstrous deeds. So, as I said, she tweeted that early this morning. Shout out to Caitlin. So she went into Israelis with their depravity. Now, let's go into this book, Abandon the Role of the Conqueror, where Abba Solomon commends Peter Beinart's radical reconception of Jewish life in Palestine in his new book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning. So that's the book that he wrote, which you can see right there. So actually, if you can zoom in, thank you. The dominant self-conception of the Jewish story is innocent, repeated persecutions, and then redemption by creation of the Jewish nationalist state of Israel. This narrative is critically examined in Peter Beinart's new book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning. Beinart's book says the maudlin story we Jews tell ourselves about our virtue and heroic endurance inoculates Jews from seeing Israel's agency in creating the resistance it faces. We must now tell a new story to answer the horror that a Jewish country has perpetuated. We are not history's permanent virtuous victim. Beinart, a former editor of the New Republic, is now editor-at-large of Jewish Currents and a New York Times contributor. He has been in a 20-year progression of seeing more and more sharply the Jewish and democratic state of Israel as anti-democratic and incompatible with Jewish tradition. He writes that support for a Jewish state has become idolatry, permitting endless killing, torture, and oppression of Palestinians. There is no limit. No matter how many Palestinians die, they do not tip the scales because the value of a Palestinian life is finite and the value of a Jewish state is infinite. Very powerful. Contemporary Jewish life is filled with that idolatry, he observes. In most of the Jewish world today, rejecting Jewish statehood is a greater heresy than rejecting Judaism itself. The book attributes the horrors imposed on 2 million human beings in Gaza not only to Israel Defense Forces, but to Jews. Worshipping a country that elevates Jews over Palestinians replaces Judaism's universal God, who makes special demands on Jews but cherishes all people, with a tribal deity that considers Jewish life precious and Palestinian life cheap. Beinart is not playing the peekaboo game of saying Jews are not responsible for Israel, and the other half of the time saying Israel is the Jewish state. He is not saying all Jews, but fairly saying representative, mainstream Jewish organizations worldwide are now Zionist. Anti-Zionist organizations are descendant, which we've seen and what we've reported on. He observes that many synagogues have an Israeli flag on the bima, platform where the Torah is read, and a prayer for Israel in the liturgy. It was predicted and warned about as the Zionist movement grew that the effect of creating a Jewish nation state would be Jews being seen in the light of that state's actions. The predicted consequence of Jewish sovereignty in Palestine to Jews in diaspora is happening. Jews feel that they're being scrutinized and called to account for Israel's actions on campuses and in the streets worldwide. So I have some thoughts here because it's almost implying not to all. And again, I will say that I'm not talking about all Jews here, as the author states, representative of. But here's the thing. I feel like it's very easy to call out when a Muslim terrorist bombs something. That's easy for people to scrutinize Islam.
Yeah.
When it's not Islam itself, it may be the radicalism of the religion. That's the problem.
Well, see, that's my thing, is that like the people, like, Jews, not all Jews, obviously,
Right.
Judaism, there might be some issues with the way it manipulates its teachings, like most religions, I would say all
Right.
of.
But right. I argue, and as a person who studied theology, I'm going to give you, I know you're an atheist, but I'm going to give the rest of you all like the Cliff Notes of the Bible, basically.
Okay.
Like
I would love to have that, by the way. There's got to be a Bible Cliff Notes.
Basically, the idea was God set a certain people group apart to be essentially an example to everyone else in the world of how to live righteously under him. But
the house on the hill,
proved in the Old,
so to speak.
Right. But as they proved in the Old Testament, they could not live up to that standard. So God had to kind of punish them continuously, and in many cases having to force them off the land that he promised them in order for them to learn. Right. In order for them to learn to depend on him and not rely on what other nations were doing, in order for them to understand the importance of following God, so to speak. But it proved too difficult for them to do that. So if you are a Christian, that's where Jesus comes in. He comes in to fulfill the role of essentially a new way of doing things without like the rigidness of the Torah, so to speak. So if you are a Christian / Jewish, that's kind of where the idea of the Torah / Bible comes from.
Atheist cultures too, where it's like suddenly, they're willing to call out Islam for all its failed teachings, but then they're suddenly quiet, when it's Judaism. So,
right.
And
it's
very similar.
Sean,
yeah.
And Sean, in the chat, you hit it on the head. You said Islam is looked at as evil, not just radical. But yet those who are Christians or Jewish get looked at as radical and not evil. Exactly.
Yep.
And look, as someone who grew up in the church for most of my life, especially within the last decade, like I've had criticisms of Christianity in terms of how, especially within the Black community, especially in the international community, especially, like in my time of Africa, like, and I shared that, with the story that Max Blumenthal reported on the ICJ judge last week. I had my issues with Christianity. So every religion deserves to be scrutinized in some way, shape, or form, not necessarily with the religions in itself, but how people practice it. So I think it's kind of odd that for everyone out, like, it's easy to call out Islam for one terrorist act, but Christians, and not so much, but especially Jews, again, not saying all Jews, but when we criticize Christianity and then Judaism, there seems to be a lot more tension about being able to criticize those religions. So, well, I feel like they have as much criticism within those religions as you would in Islam one, but then as we said, often due to the actions of a few versus
it's also just
of the many. So,
xenophobia too,
right.
Like there's like that religion is a little too melanated for them, so
right.
But
right.
I digress.
But isn't Christianity though to some regard?
Well, I mean, classically not. We had to go take
classically
boats
not, but like,
and bring Bibles to the others.
But today, Christian, like, look at where Christianity is.
Yeah.
Pretty much throughout the global South. mostly, Latin America, Africa,
Mm-hmm.
many places in Southeast Asia. So, and, so
Although I would
it's
argue
more
Islam is
melanated now.
becoming
Like,
more
look,
popular there.
even like back in the day, the fathers of the Christian faith were African. Now you can argue not black like me or dark as me, but definitely like melanated, like North Africa region, definitely were more indigenous, I would say. So, obviously we can argue, especially given the Roman Empire and all that, white people kind of took it over more so.
Yeah.
But
Well,
initially,
yeah.
Initially it was more melanated until the Romans got a hold of it.
Yeah.
And then, and then whatever.
Then it became BG Jesus. Is what you're saying.
Right. Exactly. Well, that's where the idea where white Jesus comes from, basically.
Yes. Yeah, it's Charlemagne. Technically.
Right. So right. But anyway, Beinart places the Hamas violence of October 7, 2023 in context as consistent with the history of suppressing peoples without peaceful means to contest their status, as seen in slave revolts and anti-colonial guerrilla wars. So,
language of the
you know what this reminds me of?
I'm
actually going to go to the. Oh wait, that's not it yet. Actually, wait. Did I?
Yeah.
Oh no,
one more.
I had it in right. Yeah. I note that Beinart's thoughts are resonant with what almost 100 years ago, historian and then Zionist Hans Cohen wrote of 1929 anti-Jewish riots after 12 years of Zionism colonialism in Palestine under British authority. We pretend to be innocent victims. Of course, the Arabs attacked us in August. They perpetuated all the barbaric acts that are characteristic of a colonial revolt. We have been in Palestine for 12 years since the Balfour Declaration, without even once made a serious attempt at seeking through negotiations at the consent of indigenous people. So basically, Cohen is saying they deserve to attack us because we took their land.
Occupy their land, which Geneva Code would agree with them. So,
right. And you know who else would agree?
Mr. Nelson Mandela.
Metaphor. Play it again.
Choose peace rather than confrontation, except in cases where we cannot proceed, where we cannot move forward. Then, if the only alternative is violence, we will use violence.
Gaddafi?
Arafat.
Yeah.
So Nelson Mandela was not opposed to violence if absolutely necessary. And I spoke about this last week. You know who else would, especially like in his latter days, who also wasn't necessarily opposed to violence as well? MLK.
So such thoughts take us beyond Vietnam, but not beyond our calling as sons of the living God. In 1957, a sensitive American official overseas said that it seemed to him that our nation was on the wrong side of a world revolution. During the past 10 years, we have seen emerge a pattern of suppression, which has now justified the presence of U.S. military advisors in Venezuela. This need to maintain social stability for our investments accounts for the counter-revolutionary action of American forces in Guatemala. It tells why American helicopters are being used against guerrillas in Cambodia, and why American napalm and Green Beret forces have already been active against rebels in Peru. It is with such activity in mind that the words of the late John F. Kennedy come back to haunt us. 5 years ago, he said, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable."
We did talk about MLK with this speech he did, I think, last week. And I basically said, I don't think he would have referred to that line that MLK famously said if he didn't understand the idea at that point, where violence is necessary if you have no other options. Obviously, choose the peaceful route first. But if you cannot get what you want, and that's the only method where you're going to get it, that's what you have to do. And even MLK said, riots are the language of the unheard. So while he may not necessarily have promoted that himself, he understood the reason why people would do it. And it's because, of the imperialism that, people in the global south in particular were facing. So, actually, you know what? I think we probably should do a deep dive on that whole speech because it's so powerful. Like I've only just listened to part of it, just in terms of the show, but like everyone knows about the "I had a dream" speech. Everyone knows. People, if anything, especially if you consider yourself on the left, need to hear Beyond Vietnam, because especially with what's going on today, but it kind of shows the turn that MLK took in kind of realizing, oh damn, like I was socially aware and wanted to promote, that the social culture of togetherness and like solidarity, among color, that kind of stuff. And he kind of realized that really wasn't benefiting the Black community in any way, shape, or form, because not much changed other than maybe like people were slightly nicer to Black people. So, but I argue this was probably the speech that was led to him being taken out, or at least wrapped up that point, because he was talking about economics and like imperialism. So, and again, not many people talk about that when they talk about MLK. So it could be worth maybe doing a deep dive on that speech entirely. But it kind of relates to this article and this book in saying, like basically Palestinians have a right to resist, is what he's saying, and kind of confirmed by these two Black leaders who essentially were saying the same thing. But anyway, moving on. Israeli retribution since October 7, 2023, on the 2 million plus population of Gaza and their means of life, homes, utilities, schools, universities, hospitals, has officially resulted in over 46,000 deaths and innumerable injuries directly from IDF attacks. The medical journal Lancet estimates deaths are likely much higher, and I think they reported on this is over 60, they're saying now, counting deaths from starvation, disease, or cold. Most of the population of Gaza was made homeless, huddled in impoverished shelters, pushed by IDF warnings from one safe zone, quote unquote, to another, often then bombed. Oh, here we go. Beinart's book is an analysis of Zionist apologetics that are necessary to both regard oneself as moral and defend what Israel has done, from the 1947-1949 Nakba, terroristic expulsion of Palestinian Arabs from their communities within the present-day Israel, to Gaza in 2025. He denounces demonizing Zionist lies about Palestinian resistance. These claims do not withstand even modern scrutiny. There are less arguments than talismans. They ward off dangerous emotions like grief and shame. Using the model of dismantling of apartheid South Africa, he tries to envision what principles could heal Palestine. The details matter, but they matter less than the underlying principles. Wherever they live together, Jews and Palestinians should live under the same law, and they should work to repair the injustices of the past. The Israelis who were made refugees on October 7th should be allowed to go home. And the Palestinians who were made refugees in 1948 should be allowed to go home. Greater, I would argue. Historical wrongs can never be fully undone, but the more sincere the effort, the greater the reconciliation that ensues. This would be a radical reconception of Jewish life in Palestine, that in abandoning the role of conquerors, Jews may live as Jewish Palestinians. He makes the point that whites relinquishing apartheid was a more peaceful process for South Africa than having it overthrown.
Mm-hmm.
In the summary chapter of the book, Beinart says Israel's conduct is from a heretical Jewish tendency to believe Jewish people are sacred rather than people with extra obligation. I think that's key, because that's kind of implicitly what, again, not all Jews, but a lot of Jews, maybe even somewhat more Israelis, kind of consider themselves sacred. Another word I'll probably use, which might be better, is what was I gonna say? I lost my train of thought. Damn, what was I gonna say?
The Jewish people are sacred. You felt like there was a different,
sacred, but
different way to say that.
Yeah, that I just lost my train of thought. It'll come back to me later, but
yeah, they view themselves as
the
God's chosen people, literally.
Right.
You know.
So yeah. So what if a few dreamers in Moorish Spain or the Sicilian Shiite, I guess, I don't know, Eastern European Jewish village console themselves with the idea that deep within us lies a special spark of the divine. They didn't have the power to do anything about it. This self-deification, first proposed by an Israelite named Karak, who challenged Moses' leadership, hadn't mattered as much until the creation of Jewish national power. All that changed with the creation of Israel. Once only Jews control a state with life and death power over millions of non-Jews, does Karak's claim of intrinsic Jewish sanctity become truly dangerous. Beinart calls for the liberation of Jews from the Zionist doctrine that Jews are the only victims, never victimizers. We can lift the weight that oppressing Palestinians imposes on Jewish Israelis and indirectly on Jews around the world. We can lay down the burden of seeing ourselves as the perennial victims of a Jewish-hating world. More than level of observance or denomination, the question of Zionism is going to be a fault line with Jewish fellowship, Beinart believes. Remove Jewish statehood from Jewish identity, and for many Jews around the world, it is not clear what's left. But the benefit of recognizing that Jews are not fundamentally different from other people is that it allows us to learn from their experience. Jewish exceptionalism is less exceptional than we think. We are not the only people to use a story of victimhood to justify supremacy. And I think that's a point. And the word that I was looking for was entitled. Like, it's entitlement that they feel that they're owned this land. It's an entitlement that they feel that they're owed a nation state for themselves at the detriment of the people who are living there. And, I just feel like and again, just going back to Judaism as a whole or Christianity as a whole, like the idea of them being set apart was never about land. It was about the people. Like, it was about the idea, as you said, like being a light on a hill, like being an example for other nations to flourish. Not in the sense of using their victimhood as a means to victimize other people. So it's just kind of like, as the saying goes, you live long enough to become the villain yourself or something to that end.
Right.
This is kind of what the excerpt of these books, this book reminds me of. It's like they've played victim for so long. And I don't want to say it that way because even in the Black community, I see some of this victimhood, but I think it's almost kind of done the other way where it's like, where I think generally people acknowledge what has happened to Jews, especially given the Holocaust and all of that. The difference is within the Black community, it's very hard for people, especially our politicians, to acknowledge what happened to them in terms of slavery. Like, so that's kind of the slight difference. But it's still the idea of like the victims, out of their pride or whatever you want to call it, feel that they're owed this thing, which I argue they don't. They don't. Like, and again, God took them off the land that they were promised several times because they weren't doing the shit that they were supposed to do. So, and I'm sure, so like, what makes it now that, oh, they feel that they deserve this land to the detriment of the people who have lived there for centuries peacefully? Like, to me, I just don't understand that, given, as someone who also has been, ancestrally been taken off my land forcibly. I don't have the right to kind of go in with a few of my friends to Nigeria, say, and be like, look, this land is mine. and I'm going to take it. Like, I can't do that. That makes no sense for me to do. Like, I can live alongside, peacefully with other Nigerians, but it's not to say I'm going to usurp their homes or whatever as a means to feeling that I'm owed this thing because this very thing was taken away from me, or in their case, that this thing was promised to me, from a book that, whether you believe in the Bible or not is another issue for another day. But, it's still the idea of like, there's such thing as law, like, of the land that people have to follow. And the fact that Israelis have blatantly disregarded international law for their own purposes, and the West has been complicit in that for their own purposes, I think that's the truly disgusting part. And that's, unfortunately, that's something that I don't feel is talked about among the Jewish community quite so much. And again, I could be wrong. I'm sure they may be having conversations in private, but not necessarily in a public meme where they're able to call this out. And I think, again, as Beinart says, it's kind of like, well, if we don't have this thing that we've been propagandized to believe, then what else do we have? And I feel like if your worth is more than this land, if your worth is of that land, then I have to kind of question what your values are. Because it shouldn't overstep human life. So I don't know. Like, I'll be interested as an atheist what your take is.
I mean, I think people could understand. To me, it's all of these are used exploitatively towards those means anyway, right? Because it's up to interpretation most of the time. Most of the time, there's not historical context with these things, that they're ratified by kings. A lot of the books aren't canonized that should be canon. There's a lot of like, it's always used to me since the beginning of time. Some shaman has decided that their deity thinks that we should throw rocks at another group because that deity said so. But, I find it like, I definitely think there's, again, there's this idea that Islam is bad because these brown people believe it. I think that that's definitely part of the context with this, but it's also just Judaism itself makes it to where there's always an other. It's very much like, separationist, like Christianity too, Islam too, right? They put you versus
isolation. Well, yeah, isolationists. And I think in America, it's that added bit, given our culture here, like it's, I think, amplified even more. Let me see. Do I have any more of this? I think
it's like one page left, I think.
Okay. So, I think there may be one or two. Israel's perpetual peril is the Arab population it has displaced but not exterminated yet. They're determined to redeem their birthright to live as freely in Palestine as Jews do. Instead of conquest, Beinart proposes a model of restraint, cooperation, and respect along a line of Jewish thinkers from Allah Halam to John Schmanz to Albert Einstein. Many of the visions for Jewish settlement in Palestine were universalistic and passive and pacific. In 1927, Zionist writer and Chaim Weizmann's protege, Maurice Samuel, mused in his book, I, the Jew, that Jewish civilization for 60 generations demonstrated that neither conquest or oppression was necessary to survival. A group can survive without mass murder. Whether a trauma or hubris allows Zionists in Israel and elsewhere to trust that model, finding the image of God even in their enemies is the question.
Yep. I mean, this is essentially have you no decency, you know, for the most part. And it's a person super conflicted, you know, but
yeah,
I get it. You know, you're welcome to hop off the train. We'll accept you over here in the nihilist camp. But
but
you know,
so again, could be a book. So if you go back to the cover again, like could be a book some of you might want to consider reading. If you want to be big and bold, you know, it might be something you want to give to a gift for your Zionist friends. Maybe. I don't know. But if you do read the book, let us know. I'll probably try and get it and maybe kind of read it. So that's the title, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning by Peter Beinart. Sure, you can get it wherever
books are sold.
buy books. I'm not going to tell you where.
Yep.
That's up to you, but obviously there'll be better places at this point to buy books. But that being said, no judgment if you can buy books at certain places. That's the only place you can get it. So no judgment there. You know, but if you do read it, let us know in the chat or let us know in the comments. Would you read this book? And do you believe that Beinart to be correct? That there is somewhat of a, you know, deification of Zionism to the point where it's become like a lot of Jews, whether they're Israeli or otherwise, you know, feel like they're above everybody in terms of their victimization and feel that they have a right to a land that, you know, not to say it's not theirs per se, but it's like the willingness to usurp it. Well, but the willingness to usurp it over others who have been living there, I'd argue, longer than they have. So let us know in the comments what you think. And talking about stories like these are why we are monetized. So if you want to support us financially, you can scan the QR code if you have a smartphone, or you can type in the link that you see on the screen there. Or if you're in the YouTube chat, you can type in exclamation point donate, all one word, and the link will pop up where you can click and you can give as little as $1 to help our cause here at INN, as well as this show. And as we say, you know, we know money is tough. Finances is hard for many people. So obviously, you know, if you can, you know, definitely do so. But the free version, if you prefer to do that, is like and subscribe to our content, and please share this stream or this clip to fight the suppression on YouTube, allegedly, and make sure to leave a comment. Let us know if you read the book, what you think of it, and let us know, you know, generally what you think of Beinart's points in returns to Judaism and Zionism, and, you know, as I said, the deification of it to the point where we're in the spot where we are now, and help us get to free K. I will say, I feel like there's been a lot of people subscribing over the last week in particular. So thank you guys for that. Yeah, we definitely appreciate you for doing that. Keep doing it. We want to try to see if we can get in YouTube's good graces. I'm not sure if that's ever going to happen, but we want to try. And thanks for watching.